Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Battleship Bismarck Part 38. Epilogue. For a German damned by his perceptions to recognize the creeping poison of so-called National Socialism, which seemed to me neither nationally oriented nor socialistic, the years under Hitler had to appear a veritable nightmare, a purgatory for insightful patriots. Such a German could not fail to perceive the reality of the years of 1933 to 1939 as a period in which, after the murderous elimination of effective opposition, Germany was irresistibly transformed into an intellectual, moral and cultural wasteland, a collecting ground for warlike aggression, and the years 1939 to 1945 as a period of naked assertion of physical force, of painful realization that the enemy in front of the guns was only technically the enemy, that in reality Germany's enemy was the man in the Reich Chancellery. To be sure, on May 8, 1945, such a German felt no less than any other German the deepest grief at the abrupt fall of his country into seeming nothingness. But one great consolation was granted him: that Germany's liberation from Hitler and his clique at last gave his people the opportunity to turn away from the political aberration of the past 12 years, the shame of a millennium. And he may have had the feeling that Germany couldn't sink any lower, it could only rise. From now on, I knew that everything I do in my walk of life will, after all, have a sense of civic purpose and contribute to a rational community. For the first time since 1933, that is. It was an indescribable sensation, a great hope, perhaps too great. Since after all, we had not freed ourselves from Hitler by our own exertions, but owed our freedom wholly to the victors of the Second World War. And after years of observing that National Socialism was anything but an historical accident, but that to the contrary it seemed to be written all over the Germans, with its cunning appeal to the instincts and habits ingrained in German subjects by centuries of German authorities, order and discipline, authoritarian rule and the subordination of the individual to the state, to the whole. Now it was formulated into a pithy slogan. It said, "You are nothing, your folk is everything." And had not such claims upon the quasi-hierarchical structure of the people also exerted a special attraction on military circles and the navy? The mobilization of mystical feelings slumbering in the people, dark, muddled beliefs, books like those of the English racist Houston Stuart Chamberlain, Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg's still worse myth of the 20th century, all had made their contribution to confusing the mind of a people who needed clarity and rationality more than anything else in politics. A diabolical stage production showed the Germans a future under Hitler in a radiant light. The never-ending parades, wild victory celebration, tributes to the dead, above all the glorification of death itself, were the inducement of the accentuation of the emotional, the irrational, the sensual, and the delirious. It was really no wonder that in place of a dispassionate analysis of national policy there emerged a blind faith in the Führer and his teachings. A faith, and this was the most dreadful thing, that held itself to be enlightenment. Führer command, we obey, became its everyday currency in political discourse, the attestation of a nation's intellectual abdication. And it was equally understandable that the mass of people was taken in or lacked the antennae to pick up what was going on in the background. Anyone who saw acts of spontaneous vengeance taking place in public, as on the day of the Jewish pogrom of November the 9th of 1938, no longer perceived the even worse horrors that must be raging in subterranean secrecy. I cannot claim that I myself, stemming from an arch-conservative family, was granted an early insight into the nature of the Hitler regime at its start. The standard by which I first judged Hitler was nothing more than his face, which I found repulsive. I could never read a sense of statesmanlike responsibility into him, and even his rhetorical mimicry did not enable him to supply what I missed. To expect good things for Germany from the possessor of such a miserable face, the countenance of a psychopath? Instinctively, I never could. Personally, regarding Hitler's accession to the office of Chief of Government with disgust, I lived through his decisive acts in the destruction of our legal and constitutional state in 1933 to 1934 without, professional soldier and non-lawyer that I was, fully grasping their magnitude. However, I perceived an ominous signal, a terrible impulse to reflection for the first time in the political murders instituted by Hitler on and after June the 30th of 1934. Not that I knew more about the bloody business than most people, but the public justification that Hitler offered afterwards seemed to me to leave much too much unclear, did not satisfy me. Too many dark things were obviously being skipped over. All it communicated to me was mistrust, a panicky mistrust ready to swell at any moment. This was the impression that Herr Hitler, who was so warmly regarded by the conservatives on my mental horizons, had made on me up to 1934. Immediately upon the formation of the Weimar Republic, an uncle of mine who mourned for the monarchy, a government lawyer and veteran of the Great War, not yet 50 years old, told the family that I cannot serve the state, but whose retirement pension he did not mind accepting. Towards the end of the 20s, an aunt informed me, "Your grandparents are going to vote for Hitler from now on. I've persuaded them to. Only from him can Germany expect improvement." Only with clenched teeth did the Navy celebrate August the 11th as Weimar's Constitution Day until 1932. Disreputable things were associated with it, and one didn't need to talk much about it. Everyone understood one another on the subject of this miserable Weimar. I had observed all of these standpoints in my early years without really accepting them, but I also had not fully understood them. For politics then remained a far too distant field for me. As a boarding school student and then as a naval officer, I had yet to develop a basic outlook on them. With the passage of time, I categorized Hitler politically as neither right nor left, but as a phenomenon to be understood only in its own terms, with, no doubt, a special allure to conservatives who did not hesitate to flock to his camp. Had not one of the Nazis' first public acts, the book burning in Berlin, Munich, Cologne and Königsberg on May 10, 1933, raised one of the right's own ideas to a new height? Had not a family friend once told me during my school days in the early 20s of the intellectual currents of the militant academic right? The friend had spoken rapturously, but at the age of 16 I did not perceive the political background of his words. In 1923, one of the basic documents of the anti-republican right had already prepared for the book pyres of 1933 by asserting, "We are fighting with every available means the bearers of the Jewish spirit, whose effects destroy German racial consciousness, sap German strength, contaminate German art, and stifle German idealism in the slime of materialism. We are fighting the most pernicious chimera of our era, self-emasculating pacifism, and, because of its ruinous effect on the strength of the folk, branding it as high treason to our nation. We will ceaselessly expose the true nature of the so-called democracy. We are making an assault on the un-German parliamentarianism that has done everything possible to shatter the German Reich and will never summon the strength needed for the rebuilding of the Reich." The conservative novelist Ernst Jünger of 1930 even lent a hand, writing that, in the same measure in which the German spirit gains focus and strength, for the Jew the faintest illusion of being able to be a German in Germany will become untenable, and he will see himself confronted with his final alternative. In Germany, either to be a Jew or not to be at all. What a parallel existed between the targets of the right and of the Nazis then gathering strength. I had a very different recollection of people of leftist political tendencies, a few teachers from my school days, rational critics distanced from all mass illusions. They had often spoken contemptuously of the hurrah patriotism they had witnessed during the First World War, and this was only a decade before the new breed of Sieg Heilers appeared in the forums of the Third Reich. A more discriminating patriotism was permitted on the left. I myself, in continuous self-doubt and inner antipathy to the figure of Hitler, could simply not convince myself that Hitler's revolution was a revolution at all. If from today's perspective the decisive effects of his regime on Germany, the displacement of the old Prussian upper class and the necessity for its replacement by another, the dissolution of Prussia, the disappearance of the capital from Berlin, and the division of Germany may appear as the result of a deliberately initiated revolutionary process, I could not discover a corresponding serious start in Hitler. A man like Otto Strasser may have aimed at a truly socialistic reformation of German society, but Hitler? What did he do other than for a tyrannical, only outwardly glorified as messianic, aims to collect all those dissatisfied with the Republic into militant organizations in which, with the help of a mystical racial ideology, to bind a narcoticized people to a pseudo-religious mass illusion and to transform Germany into a circus of fanatical frenzy and ruthless inquisition and the Germans into political St. Vitus dances? Did not his public appearances and those of his rhetorical stand-ins mask the fact that everything was undertaken only to keep Hitler and themselves at the levers of power, even at the cost of the nation's welfare? That Hitler's revolution was a revolution in disguise, one that was in fact an archaic, shameless, brutalizing reaction? Only the dynamic of his power, his coordination which flattened out the social groups and classes into a community of the folk, and of the war he unleashed could, in their totality, transmit the impression of a consciously contrived social revolution to his posterity. Even after the serial murders in the summer of 1934, my progress along the path of growing recognition of the depravity of the National Socialist regime was by no means straightforward and untroubled. For a young man, politically uninformed, fundamentally immature in surroundings in which devotion and loyalty to Hitler were the order of the day, such a development would have been very difficult. Over and over, beside my doubts about Hitler, I felt doubts about myself. Could it really be that so many Germans viewed him wrongly and so terribly few rightly? And then there were always Hitler's radio broadcasts. Whether I listened to them by order or was magnetized by the mere sound, what rhetorical cascades fell over me, what dizzying eloquence. What achievements could he not endlessly enumerate? The chaos in Germany overcome and order restored, unemployment conquered and millions of jobless reintegrated into the productive process, the dictate of Versailles dismantled step by step, German military sovereignty re-established, a persuasive, incontrovertible presentation. Once, in the beginning of 1936, he particularly praised the German soldier as the support of his state, as the arms-bearer of the nation, flattering the German officer. How gullibly did we take the bait. Even the ceaseless repetition of such recitals was not wearisome, but allowed the glow of persistent past successes to light up the future in which things would most definitely continue to improve. Like the beating of a powerful surf, Hitler's speeches repeatedly swept me off the ground of seemingly unshakable skepticism and aversion, and I found myself swimming against doubt. Wasn't I in error? Mustn't I reorient my basic outlook? But, remarkably, such agonizing uncertainty never lasted more than 2 or 3 days, and then I was myself again. No, his venomous speech, his burning fanaticism, his irrational outbursts of anger appeared somehow fraudulent, intellectually questionable, and the man wasn't right. Instinct, more than understanding, told me these things. And so, I could never fully explain myself rationally, could never prove it. It was a spectral existence, as if between 2 worlds. My God, why are you so dejected? A girlfriend asked me that question when, in the summer of 1937, I returned to Berlin after a long absence. If you're thinking that something happened recently to depress me, I replied, it's not that. I can't think of anything of the sort this year or even 1936. No, it's something else entirely, apparently insignificant, for a long time now even commonplace. I believe that today was the day I sat down once too often in a restaurant near some of those loudmouthed, as you well know, black uniformed people who consider bodily measurements and the color of one's hair and eyes as valuable instruments of national policy. These physically trained, worldview indoctrinated, nationalistically supercharged men regard the Aryan as the measure of all things and as such entitled to rule the world and eliminate everyone not of their kind. When I come to think that such criminal nonsense has been stuffed into young people's heads since 1933, that this will continue and that it will never be possible to set things right in this state, then only some sort of historical catastrophe can put an end to such nonsense. When and how it will come, I can't say, but it hangs over us like eternity. That was only a year before the murderous Jewish pogrom, the public performance of racial madness. Of course, where wood is planed, shavings fall, someone applied to this, which gradually became the most absurd of all sayings, to that outrage. Hermann Göring had used it once in a speech at Essen in March of 1933. The Jewish department stores there had been shut down by the state and completely innocent people arrested and mistreated. The latter were the shavings. Thereafter, the saying became very fashionable and was always thought suitable when referring to the victims of the Brown tyranny. The planning went on according to the Führer's recipe for 12 years. And when in 1945 the plane fell, the shavings included 4 million German war dead, the unity of the Reich, 1,000 years of German territorial history, and ruins spread over the country. If only the great planner had tasted his testament. Others who made their way through the Third Reich but felt budding doubts about its course engraved themselves in my memory with the words that they had to participate or remain at their posts in order to prevent worse from happening. No doubt many of them did individual good, meritoriously, even nobly, but from a national perspective, did they prevent worse? If indeed so, then unfortunately it was only to the benefit of the worst. If Hitler said any one thing that continually outraged me over the years, it was that he bore the responsibility for his policies before history. From his mouth, nothing more than a big empty aphorism. For a head of government must face the constitutional judges of his time. If, like Hitler, he does not admit or even eliminates them at the start of his regime, then, in truth, he permits no criticism and must therefore fear it, and the phrase "responsibility before history" turns out to be hollow nonsense. When does this history begin? Who defines and evaluates it, and who sits on the judge's bench? One of these subsequent historical schools or a subsequent government qua historical institute according to the demands of the day? As long as the frustrated politician who refers to history as alive, for him it will not have begun. A convenient court, namely none at all. And does one who feels absolutely no official responsibility have need of even such a court? My outer life until 1945, becoming a naval officer, war, victory and defeat, can truly be seen as the regulation sought for a man of my origins and upbringing, the internal and external challenges in perfect harmony. But the appearance is deceptive, for the harmony was broken as of 1934. Inwardly shaken to the core to see Hitler misusing the idealism of German youth and the patriotism of the mature generations more and more from year to year, gradually to recognize him as the gravedigger of civilized Germany, in the execution of the Führer's will, myself a servant of the state who would have to lay hands on the Reich, to have to assist in maintaining the defensive wall behind which Hitler could commit murder the more undisturbed, to be nothing other than one of the Führer's assistant undertakers of the Reich, to perform nationalistic duties instead of real duties, to pursue civic values instead of real values. In all of them, I beheld the suffocating, crushing challenges of my time. But the insight upon which I did not act, which did not keep me from being among the participants, establishes guilt, personal guilt. Hitler's ruthless tyranny, his deadly security apparatus, the senselessness of isolated resistance, a resistance without a chance, lessen the guilt. But a residue will remain until the end of my days. I cannot amortize it, too much is irretrievable past. It will live on only as shame and mourning, and as the lifelong forfeiture of the claim ever again to step before a German youth. I have spoken of hope for Germany, hope after 1945, perhaps too great a one. No, until now at any rate, it has not shown itself to be too great. The 12-year wait has been rewarded and apparently continues to be rewarded. In a sadly reduced area, to be sure, a cost of Hitler, and painfully separated from my beloved Silesia, the land of my childhood, for decades now I have been a citizen under the most liberal constitution that I have been politically conscious of experiencing in Germany. Until now, our citizens have on the whole made good use of it, but a constitution is nothing more than an instrument of the intellect. And in the presence of the authoritarian tendencies deeply embedded in the German mind, in the end it will only be the citizen himself who develops it into the measurement of a lasting democracy. Or he does not. National Socialism was identical to the greatest mass movement Germany ever brought forth. Its historical roots were deep and abundant. They made it easy for Hitler immediately to transform his initially legal government into a diabolical regime such as even the most authority-enamored among us would never have believed possible. It was a mentality formed by centuries that the great demagogue manipulated, but it was a mentality, and these grow and change only slowly. So it would be a wonder if National Socialism should have disappeared as abruptly and totally as the Battleship Bismarck and our surface strategy did in the Atlantic on May the 27th of 1941, or as abruptly as the succession of outward phenomena since May the 8th of 1945 might indicate. And indeed, such a wonder neither occurred nor is it to be expected around the next corner. The dark past, a closed chapter, dead and buried by authority of a democratic constitution? No, unfortunately not. What takes long to ripen, takes long to wither. The preamble for such a speedy burial would have been lacking when the time came for it. What was the situation at the beginning of the democracy? The generation responsible for reckoning with the results of the vile regime continually suppressed the past and withdrew into a stony silence. Neither the school teachers nor the parents at home enlightened the children properly, surely out of shame or cowardice. An immediately inaugurated age of political restoration brought former leading Nazis to the highest position in the Federal Republic. The democratically imperative need to square accounts with the perpetrators of the vanquished regime, including its legal aspects, was pursued hesitantly, half-heartedly, or not at all, as Jörg Friedrich has given us another convincing proof in his book Die Kalte Amnestie, which means the cold amnesty. Judges who sat on the murderous People's Court and on the more than 20 special courts supposedly responsible for criminal and political offenses but in reality serving to suppress the political opposition, were seldom, if ever, held to account and for the most part escaped due expiation for their misdeeds. They and other merciless persecutors of members of the opposition and enlightened patriots have often experienced undeserved clemency under the jurisdiction of the Federal Republic. Of course, for a long time there has been talk that we must overpower the past. But what does this miserable word really mean? Its phonetics alone indicate an unnatural act of force, a sweeping under the carpet of all the horrors, and if this succeeds, please don't bring them up again. Only a large enough carpet has not been found and never will be. Therefore, why not, in place of fits of overpowering, a simple, honest assessment of the past, a true self-examination? It would be the proper, until now neglected step on the path to a self-ordained instead of decreed democracy. So many unhealthy symptoms are appearing ever more unmistakably. The again increasingly evident anti-Semitism, the necessity to resist the Auschwitz lie with a penal law, which in its part was diluted by a mentality of setting off the post-war expulsions of Germans against the Auschwitz horrors. The scandalous conduct of neo-Nazi groups, the belittling of the victims of the resistance to Hitler, a recent glaring attempt on the part of members of the ruling conservative Bonn coalition to bend the course of justice in a social democratically government state to its wishes, in other words, to make, as it were, the legal system the whore of politics. Citizens who saw through this political game being played for the preservation of political power and to the detriment of the administrations of justice and who had lived through Nazism could immediately recall Goebbels' dictum, the legal system must not be the master, but the servant of state policy. This dictum of March 1942 was the prelude to the resolution of the Great German Reichstag of April 26th, which officially made Hitler the supreme magistrate of the Reich. And whoever remembers that also remembers Winston Churchill's words that vigilance is the price of freedom. It always will be. And with these words, we're done. Battleship Bismarck is finished, and we have witnessed Burkard's journey through history aboard what is arguably the most famous battleship of all time, as well as his time as a prisoner of war. There will be an in-depth book review, don't worry, but I will say this for now. I found this book extremely interesting and informative, and I can recommend it wholeheartedly. The author himself finished his law degree in post-war Germany and became a diplomat, being sent to the West Indies, the Congo, which at the time was called Zaire, later Tanzania, and finally becoming consul general in Toronto, Canada. He died in 2003 near Munich, aged 92. Now, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching and listening. Let me know what you think in the comments and consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Until next time, cheers and bye-bye.